nevertheless. We're gathered here today for Greg to give a seminar. It's probably going to lead to a paper within his PhD thesis. Kirsten is his principal supervisor from Northern Institute, and I'm co-supervising from the REAL, Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research. I'll hand it over to Greg to describe the topic that he'll be in today, but pretty fascinating bit of analysis that I've been lucky to see, so we thought we'd share it with all of you. Go ahead, please, Greg. Greg Barber.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming too, and including that mob online. I'm not sure if I'm seeing you up there or you're seeing my bald spot. It's great to have you all here. I'm very keen to get some brains onto this topic that I've been squirreling away at for a while now. And if at the end of today you're able to give me feedback and a go, no go as to whether you think this is solid science and should be published, that would be amazing. Andrew, maybe you could just take notes as we go of anything I commit to following up, or any questions that people have. Yeah, so that I'll forget. So I just need somebody to keep those notes for me. So because of the place that I am, I'm not going to spend much time going through the Savannah Science 101. Instead, I'll talk a little bit about the problem that I'm trying to solve. Then I'll spend most of my time talking about the methodology that I've used, which is novel for this, this sort of field. And then I'll talk mainly about the results, but particularly about what the results mean and do they have a strong ecological basis. There's many ways to model various phenomena, but we're not simply trying to show what the variation consists of and how to describe it. We want to pull out meaningful ecological coefficients that can then be applied in other models, or that make sense when you're actually out there in the field. So this is the problem.
Let me just close that.
Close it. It's all new to me, mate.
Yeah.
Oh, we go. Some of you would be familiar with this, this phenomenon called woody thickening. That's where in savannas it's been observed over time that the tree cover is getting thicker. This has even been observed and described on a global basis. But there's still a lot of argument about whether it is indeed happening and where it's happening and what might be the causes of it. So different drivers have been put up for why this would be occurring. Some people think that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is fertilising the trees, making them grow faster. A little sideline to that is that some people think maybe the CO2 is causing more precipitation use efficiency. For example, hi, how are you? For example, I guess if the leaf stomata don't have to open as wide in order to get the gas they need, then there'd be less transpiration occurring. So the mechanism by which CO2 fertilisation might be occurring is itself discussed. Fire is a big one, of course. You all understand about that. Browsing animals, you know, we poached all the elephants and now the trees are growing. There's papers on that and how that's come in. When they talk about changes in tree cover, sometimes they talk about how tree and grasses could be alternative stable states. That is, one having gained the upper hand is likely to persist. And of course, fire in particular is one of the mediating things that tips the balance between that kind of ecological warfare going on between trees and grass. And there's quite a number of papers about this that you can read, but I've approached it with a new, I guess, statistical method. So the papers that are out there, often there's studies based on tree trunk measurements at different intervals. I'm sure Andrew's sort of hugged thousands of trees over the years. Maybe some of you have been involved in it as well. That happens, of course, at intervals and only at certain plots. People have looked at the canopy and whether it's expanding, usually using periodic and not often evenly spaced aerial photographs. Some of that work's been done out in Kakadu in various places. And in some of the global studies, they just look at overall greenness rather than tree cover. And they're using remote sensing for that. And even compared to 10 years ago, there's so much remote sensing data now, it's like drinking from a fire hose. So in Northern Australia, of course, now we've got these long-running fine-scale data sets for the entire landscape. On the left there is the Greenness, that's the Landsat fractional cover. There's precipitation. By the way, if you look at that, those little thin lines are the projects that you've done on for emissions purposes in Australia. Nearly 50% of this whole eco region is covered by an emissions or fire burning project. You can see the thin lines there. So we have precipitation, and we also have fire severity as a result of all the work that's been done here at CDU. So how to put them all together? Well, if we can measure tree canopy expansion over time and relate that through some kind of allometric to the amount of woody biomass that's there on ground, living above ground trees, right? That's another piece of work that I've done, and I'll be happy to present at another time. But take it for now that if we can look down from above and see the tree canopy getting wider, we can make some assumptions that the actual amount of biomass in the tree trunk and the whole woody component is getting bigger as well. And then what we want to do is want to allocate these changes to human actions, such as fire management, and other environmental drivers that humans don't control, like rainfall, CO2, or whatever. And then if you can separate out those two effects, you've got what we need, which is the classic baseline and credit system. We understand the natural variation that's occurring, and we understand the human impact. That's not to say that the baseline is not the amount of carbon that's there on day one. The baseline is the counterfactual, our estimate of what would have happened if the humans hadn't intervened in that particular place and particular time. The effect of the human intervention, in this case, fire management, reducing fire severity, of course, then becomes what you aim to credit. And when you develop crediting methodology, you can receive payments for the sequestration. At the moment, all those projects, or many of them anyway, are getting credits just for reducing the fire emissions and particularly the trace gases. But if we could estimate how much, if we can find that it is in fact expanding, the living biomass is expanding as a result of the new fire regime, well, then we could develop a methodology and credit that too. And for that matter, it could go into the national inventory, and we could show more comprehensively what's going on with carbon stocks and flows in the Australian landscape. So here's a project you'll be familiar with. It's the West Arnhem Land Fire Abatement Project. And the green dots there are the level of greenness that's observed by Landsat in the late dry season, that is September, October, November. Now, I'm assuming all the way through here that at that time of year, any green stuff is mostly trees, because the grasses, as you know, is typically dried out by then. Now, there's some little things to discuss about that if you want to ask me about that variable. But right now, what we've got is you can see there over 21 years of data is a slow, steady increase in greenness in the late dry season, tree cover. Now, with something like that, it would be tempting to just sort of fit a line. And that's actually quite a nice fit there. But what you're getting there is really an intercept, and you're getting a slope, I guess, that describes what's going on, and some errors, but that's about all you're getting. And okay, we can say that statistically, linearly, there appears to be an overall increase in time. But the methods that I'm using, the toolkit of time series analysis, is somewhat different. We're not simply trying to describe the phenomenon. We're actually using various parts of the toolkit and bringing time into the equation in various ways in order to, from observing the data that's getting generated and from looking at the statistical properties of that data as it comes out, using that to understand what's going on inside the data generating process, which in this case is a living ecosystem. Okay, so by looking at what's going on, we can start to actually understand what's going on inside this machine. But in any case, what I'm aiming to do is take all of those various phenomena, those culprits that have all been posited as possible drivers of increased tree cover, and I'm trying to separate them all out so that we can test them and understand which ones might work. So in order to do that, we do things a little bit differently. Time series analysis, it's still linear regression, same as they taught us in first year biology or whatever. But now you start to bring time in as a variable and extract ecological meaning from the statistical properties. Of course, it's perfect for a baseline and credit methodology because you want to understand what would have happened before our intervention, and then you want to be able to estimate what happened as a result of our intervention. And it contrasts with some of the other approaches that are being used in this field at the moment. Mechanistic modelling, where you design a little set of equations that shows how this, maybe like building a little toy car, that really runs. T-tests and these sort of frequentist approach. In frequentist approach, I guess what you're doing is you're taking samples, and then from the sample you're trying to understand the whole. Well, in this instance, we don't need to take samples because we can observe the whole thing. I mean, we can observe a 25 square metre pixel, and we've got 30 years of data on that, as well as all those other sources. Now, in this instance, I chose the carbon crediting projects because I just thought it'd be more interesting, more pertinent. But with the right computing power and the right system, I mean, of course, you could actually look at the whole thing rather than simply having to sample it and then extrapolate from that. And so the formula you get is a fairly simple one. You've got your dependent variable over there on the left. Of course, your left. Of course, you've got an intercept. All these equations have one. We then use the same dependent variable, but at t-1, so last year's value for tree cover. In this case, we're trying to estimate the levels of tree cover. You can throw in some environmental variables as well, because it might not just be last year's tree cover that's the best estimate. And then from that, you get some errors. And normally we sort of toss the errors out. In time series analysis, the errors become very important. You want to go through those errors and you want to find out first of all, is there anything time related still in those errors? Right. So that's why I would then, next thing I would do is I would then plot the errors against time to see if there's still a time trend that I haven't explained yet. But you'll also look for other things like, does it relate to any of our other environmental variables, or is there any pattern going on that we can observe? Is the variance getting higher or lower over time? Any sort of pattern that's unexplained. And of course, what you really want is the coefficients to these variables. It's the coefficients that make ecological sense. And I always like coefficients that can be immediately compared to something real. So for example, well, what have we got? We've got this year's level of greenness, green cover, in the late dry season, compared to last year's, and then we've got a coefficient. So how important is that coefficient? Is it sticky? I mean, it's woody vegetation, right? It can't just be 0% one day and then sort of, 100% cover the next day. There's got to be some kind of built-in relationship. And this idea of alternative stable states, trees and grass, well, that's targeting that, right? If I was to go through and chainsaw down every tree in a hectare of savanna, then under the alternative stable states theory, I could come back in 50 years' time and it would still just be grass, because grass had taken over that site, okay? And that would imply a very strong relationship between this year's and last year's data, okay? So that's the first time element. But then we've got some other environmental variables too that I want to talk about. So as I said, my main dependent variable is that fractional green Landsat. We've got it going back to 1987. I use September to November seasonal data. These are already made. I mean, I just pull them down and use them. And I say that represents a good proxy for woody vegetation. T-1 is just the same value, but a year ago. The severe fire variable, now this is derived from the exact same source of data. It's really ultimately derived from Greenness. I think we've got some guys at the uni who are working on this at the moment. But we have an old one that goes back 2003, 2018, which tells me the annual percentage of any polygon that was severely burnt in that year. And then we've got rainfall. Up here, the rainfall set is a kind of a layer created from extrapolating different measuring stations. There's not many of them, of course, across the savanna bioregion, and sometimes you'll find they've got missing data. So there's already some error associated with that, but it means for any pixel or any plot or any polygon or any property, I can work out what the rainfall was supposed to be. And I use the 12 months prior to when I then measure my greenness. We've got the errors, as I say, they're supposed to be random. The mean should be 0, no time-based trend, no bias, no relationship to our other variables, and then T, which is time, it's years, it's just 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. But it's a proxy for other trends that are going on, including rising CO2 and its effects. If we find a time-based trend left over at the end, we're going to want to explain what that is. So taking, again, the Wolfer example, and there were 96 different carbon projects that I used as my polygons for sampling this data. That's what severe fire's been doing, and you know why. This is around about the period in which the program of traditional burning's been reinstated. There's only 16 years of data there, so that immediately narrows down my, that's the limiting factor on how long my time series is for now. That's what rainfall's doing at the same time. So, you know, I've already got some sort of culprits there for what might be driving this change. And you run that, what you simply do is run that as using the formula that I showed earlier. I haven't shown what lagged greenness looks like. That's just the same greenness curve back 1 year. You put those variables together and you get a result. And I've had to use a threshold for these. Typically, I'm using about a 90% likelihood threshold. So if they're 10%, I say, if it's a 10% chance my calculation's off, well, okay. But I've got 96 different projects here, and I'll show you what they all look like when you take all of their different coefficients and put them together. Now, after doing that regression, I get some errors, as I say, and this scale here, of course, is percentage, so that's percentage green cover. Sort of plus or minus 2% in my errors there. Here's 2010, where we had the El Nino, the breaking of the drought was huge up here and huge across the arid zone. So not surprisingly, with all that extra rain, well, trees didn't respond quite as quickly as the overall coefficient would suggest. Yeah, so that's why you get an error in that case. But rather than, and so then I plotted a line of best fit just to see if there was any leftover correlation with the variable T for time. No, it's not significant. Yes, there's a slight trend there, but it doesn't reach significance. This sort of plotting, the other problem with this sort of plotting and just plotting lines through things is it can be very sensitive to what's happened at either end of your distribution. If you were to get a couple extra dot points there or a couple extra there, we might change the slope a little bit. But at the moment, I'm pretty happy that in I think every one of our projects, bar one, we had no leftover time trend at the end that requires further explanations. So from that point of view, we're looking good. But when you generate coefficients for different variables, you want to know that they have some actual ecological meaning and they're not just curve fitting, if you like. And so having collected all the coefficients, the coefficient for rainfall, the coefficient for severe fire, the coefficient for lagged woody vegetation and the impacts that it had, I then wanted to plot them in a way that would make sense. And so I plotted all of the coefficients against long-term average rainfall. We know that's quite important for savannas. We know as you go from north to south and to a certain extent from west to east in this ecoregion, you get some changes that are related to that. Of course, rain can create the fuel for fire as well. So rain's quite important. I could have used, I guess, my starting value or my ending value for tree cover, but that's also going to be subject to the sort of management regime that's in place. So I just thought, we'll just plot them against long-term average rainfall and see if it means anything. So here's this coefficient for severe fire. And what it says is that for every 1% of your polygon that is burnt severely, you will get a 0.5% reduction, in this instance here, in the amount of greenness for the year overall. Okay, now of course we know when a severe fire comes through, it burns everything, browns it all off. Okay, with dead leaves everywhere, and they start falling. But in this instance, that's how the coefficient comes out for severe fire when included with the other variables. As you can see, some of the coefficients come from non-significant, or let's say less than 10% threshold significant linear models, but quite a number of them, half of them actually, came out as statistically significant to the 90% threshold. And so I plotted them, and then I put a line of best fit through the significant ones so that you can get an idea of what might be going on here. This little red dot here is Walter, if you're interested, in case you wanted to know how it came out. It actually came out at about 12% PR value, whereas I've been using the threshold of 10. And the other thing we can see is that as you get into high rainfall zones, and clearly where tree cover's higher, the effect of severe fire is it has more of an effect on tree cover because there's more to burn, so therefore more is burned. You can see that trend going on as we get up to right to the very west areas in this whole eco-region. I think might be somewhere west of Cape York. So that doesn't tell us anything amazing. That kind of makes sense. Then I looked at the rainfall coefficient. Okay, so think of this a bit like precipitation use efficiency. For a given unit, for a certain number of millimetres of rainfall, you will end up with a certain amount of cover, green cover, at the end of that year. In this case, I put the line of best fit through all the dots, not just the statistically significant ones. But you can see what's going on here. I mean, despite what you might first thought, in high rainfall zones, the effective rainfall on green cover is negative. I'm presuming that's because there's already enough rain there, and more rain doesn't help trees grow more. Maybe there's a lot of cloud when there's a big wet, so maybe trees don't grow as much. This is the thing I'm interested to get your perspective on, because we want to know that these coefficients aren't just curve fitting, they're actually coefficients that make ecological sense. So yes, indeed, down in the driest areas, the effect of rainfall is positive. As soon as those trees get some rain, they start growing. But in the very wettest areas, it's actually a negative effect. I don't know how you compare all these coefficients, but that might not even be a straight line. It might actually be some sort of non-linear effect that's going on there, where when you get into areas of extremely high rainfall, which are very non-variable rainfall. I mean, high rainfall is generally pretty reliable. Low rainfall, of course, is very random, or has some sort of distribution, maybe a log normal distribution or something like that. So, I mean, I guess this is why this is not a very interesting form of analysis to use in a boreal forest or a temperate environment. There wouldn't be that much going on. And even when fire happens, well, it happens infrequently and catastrophically, kind of hard to model that. We've got a different thing here. Might explain why I haven't really been able to find a lot of papers that have actually used this method to analyse ecosystems, but it just got me a bit spooked. But anyway, we'll continue on. Now, this is the one where it gets a bit tricky. This is plotting the coefficient between last year's green fractional cover and this year's green fractional cover. Remember I said if it was sticky, we'd be looking for a coefficient around about the level of 1. Well, for the statistically significant ones, it does come in around about 0.6 typically. I think it's about 1, it might have been 0.52 for the black dots. And that's saying that last year's tree cover certainly has some influence on this year's, but it's not rigidly sticky. Whereas for some of these others, we get a lot more sort of mess and so on. And Walter there, for example, there's effectively a 0 coefficient. Now it's non-significant, but that's two different things. We're saying if there's a 0 coefficient, then effectively that term just drops out of the equation because last year's cover really has no influence on this year's cover. Right? And I plotted it according to average rainfall, just to show you how the pattern. So, you know, possibly a pattern where it's higher in high rainfall zones. But there was something else that I wanted to try with this one, and that was to look at the effect of severe fire itself. See you later, mate. No worries. So I came up with this thing called the fire severity factor, and that is that on average, how many times was that area burnt severely? Okay, so if it was burnt sort of, you know, 10%, if 20% of it was burnt in this year, then over 5 years, you might say on average it was burnt completely, it was burnt 100%. In our most extreme examples, there were sites here that were burnt on average 7 times over the 16 years of this data. And clearly that's not a site that's being managed for fill. Okay, yeah, when I said there were 96 projects, I should say some of those projects have actually been deregistered over time. Some of them are still registered, but they're not actually generating credits. So without really knowing what the land management history of each site is and have some way of bringing that in, I haven't really got anything more to go on there. But in these areas, yeah, quite a lot of severe fire and very little relationship between this year and last year's fractional cover in a statistical sense. Elsewhere, it's better. So that's the end, really. What I'm hoping I've come up with is some coefficients that make ecological sense. I've observed that severe fire shows stronger effects, as you would expect when green cover is higher. If the rainfall coefficients really do represent precipitation use efficiency, then, you know, we need a good explanation as to why that would be a negative effect where rainfall is in the highest zones. I think I found one project that had a remaining time-based trend that requires explaining. Well, if there's only one in 94, it's clearly not CO2 that's doing it, because CO2 is the same everywhere. Okay, we need another explanation for that. There's some mixed lagged coefficient results there. Ponder why it would be sticky. There'd be a sticky relationship over time in tree cover in some places, but not in others. But look, even if it's non-significant, you can still have it as a useful coefficient in your model. You can't say that coefficient can be used, but it's used in order to strip out variation and give some more strength to some of your other coefficients, particularly the ones we're most interested in, like rainfall and fire. So that's my project. It's just been me, you know, chipping away at it for a while and showing Andrew. I was very keen to get a group of brains together and generate some questions, maybe even tell me if I've forgotten something. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for your time.
Stop sharing so we can look at them. If anybody online is posing any questions, I'm opening the chat here so we can see it. Okay, nothing yet, but please go ahead. Anyone in the room? Probably want a microphone so people online can hear.
Yeah, look, thanks for that talk. It was really interesting. Just got a comment about being cautious of equating green cover with tree cover on one hand, and then the relationship between green cover and carbon is a bit more problematic. And so just unpacking that, the green cover is both trees and shrubs. And, you know, our experience is shrubs are often the things that respond to reduce fire severity rather than trees themselves. And so the implications for carbon storage are big there, and obviously because shrubs are not storing the carbon as a tree would have equivalent cover. But the other is, I'm not sure how this works, but when you have a fire coming through and it causes canopy scorch and the leaves drop, so you're going to get a reduction in green cover, but that doesn't reflect carbon storage. You know what I mean? And yeah, and so how you can deal with that, because it's going to be an obvious thing. You have a fire, particularly late season fire, of course it's going to reduce green cover because the leaves are all scorched and dropped, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of the vegetation dynamics and how you do it.
We assume that severe fire compared to non-severe fire is burning off all that canopy, including some of which might have been green at some point, and creating kind of an energy deficit over time. And this is this is what everybody's been trying to get to with severe fire versus non-severe, is at what point does that actually start to slow down the rate of carbon accumulation by that ecosystem?
No, that's right. But that's a different, that's a much more complicated question than just knowing the green, green cover at the end of the dry season. And there's a lot of assumptions there that it will flow through, and maybe it will, but I suspect it's not a simple matter of that.
But that's why we're doing it at the time. Right? Like we're not saying that carbon just disappeared, woody biomass just disappeared because there was a fire. We're saying that an energy deficit over time saw that forest grow less than one next door, maybe, that was receiving an early fire.
Yeah, although even growth, maybe I said enough, even growth, greenness is not necessarily reflecting growth because it's reflecting the expression of leaves. So you don't have to grow in terms of carbon. Yeah.
So I'm assuming it's the second question about the shrubs or the mix of, we don't know if this is the existing trees adding more to the trunks and then adding more to their canopies, or whether it's recruitment, new trees. You could get baby trees that could come up, whole crop baby trees could come up, and that could actually increase the green cover by the exact same quantity. So you can't go straight from just knowing green cover to knowing the allometrics of those tree trunks, especially if it's changing over time.
Yeah, no, exactly. But in terms of shrub responses versus tree recruitment, we've got a lot of data to show that tree recruitment's pretty rare, whereas a shrub response, you see that anywhere where you exclude fire and you just get this massive shrub response.
Let's say that, sorry. So you've got other studies that say that if trees get through 3 years without severe fire, then they'll be effectively fireproof and they'll get up and they're likely to eventually recruit into the big canopy, right? If I wanted to test that, I wouldn't just say what was last year's severe fire. I'd actually say what's the 3-year lags, or I'd construct another variable out of the severe fire one to say, well, if you have no severe fire for 3 years, what effect does that have on green canopy? Because the tree's now this high and a severe fire won't, or any fire won't affect it. So yes, this doesn't tell us anything about the dynamics of the structure of those trees. Doesn't tell us anything about the floristics, right? There are other databases and things that Andrew and I have been working on that are looking at that sort of stuff, but I won't have a perfect answer. I'll never have a perfect answer for you on that. You want to measure the whole of the carbon body in the whole of the savanna ecoregion, where you can't measure the trees individually, right? You can't just go out and do plots and then extrapolate, because it wouldn't solve your problem.
No, but you can with LiDAR do it next day.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. LiDAR's more expensive and got 30 years worth, and it would be a great way to test against the Severity, actually. So I've mentioned that in my draft report, that LiDAR, radar, a bunch of other things can all be used to either to test against these varieties that way.
So with the greenness that you're using, the greenness cover, so you've used areas that are existing carbon projects, and we know that they're managing those landscapes better these days than they were previously. So is that greenness measure just a fact that, well, there's less fire now, or less severe fire, so the greenness numbers are larger because there's more areas that are green, and not an actual change in any structure or any shrubs, but just a change in the fact that there's more green?
There's more green, what I assume to be woody vegetation. There's more green, what I assume to be woody vegetation.
But it could have been there before, it's just that it had its leaves because of the late fire. And now there's less late season fire, so you actually have no change in structure at all. It's just that historically there was more late dry season fire, therefore the average of those green numbers are off.
Right.
And now when you have better managed landscapes where the average of those green numbers is higher.
Yep.
But it's not actually a change in any structural or any cover. It's just a change in a green value?
Yeah, so it's a change in the timing of fire across the year that's doing it.
Which will affect the persistent green.
Absolutely, very interesting. So what I've tried to do is I tried to use the typical NAFI data, which is monthly fire scars, okay? And so I used early and late rather than severe fire. Now that's, it doesn't match up perfectly with severe fire. So I would have loved to have known severe fire and severe fire by month, right? But they don't match up perfectly. So yeah, there could be a temporal shift over time, but I'd have to go back and use NAFI data to show that. Yes, I need a test. I need a test to see whether that's simply the reason for the rise. Yep. Yeah. But I can only use the NAFI data. I can't use the severe fire data because it's not broken down by month.
It will be.
And by the way, I mean, it's 16 data points, so at 4 variables. So in terms of degrees of freedom, if I got 1 or 2 more years of severe data right now, that would make a big difference. Some of these significant thresholds.
Yeah, excuse my ignorance maybe with this question, but flying on from that, why did you particularly choose that time period for woody vegetation? Was it, yeah, because yeah, how long does it take for green to come back on scorched canopy? Okay, but what's the minimum, maximum?
Because you're confident it's a week and it is still green, whereas we do it at the end of the wet, if it goes grass.
Ah, okay, yeah, okay, yep. Yep. Okay, to exclude grass for people online.
Sorry, you'll be next. Question on your methodology. So you developed one regression per site, right? Yeah, a multiple linear regression for each site. Yeah. What you didn't show is how good the fit was for each of the sites.
Yeah.
So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
So the fit is quite variable.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's really good. You can get anything up to 87% R squared, for example, but some of the fits are really poor. I mean, where you get some of the variability in the coefficients. No, not specifically. Well, if you have a lot of non-significant coefficients, if for example severe fire is significant, but rainfall and lagged isn't, well, of course you go from multiple R squared down to adjusted R squared, and it falls very quickly. But I didn't want to dump out variables that were non-significant. I wanted the same set of explanatory variables in every model. And for those institutional reasons, when it comes to crediting it, I think you also want those. Depends how they're going to use it. I mean, they could take these sorts of coefficients and put them into the full CAM model, it's, you know, mechanistic model. But I don't know why you would if you can just look at this year's cover and then next year get another measure of cover. You know, like, why use a model to predict what you can simply observe down to the 25 metre level? So yeah, it varies and it depends very much on which coefficients are significant and how many of the 3 important ones are significant.
I've got 2 questions. One is, what empirical evidence is there from any of these studies? Have you got any empirical correspondence to compare your models with? I know there are empirical studies going on in some of these areas, but my second one comes out of Billy's question, which is there's been a change in the timing of the first rain sufficient to cause grass germination in the wet season. And I think you'd probably want that as a factor in your models, because it's coming in, sometimes it's even as early as September, quite often October, and very frequently November. And there's that trend, it's got a spatial variation. It comes in later in Cape York, I think. Anyway, I did something 10 years ago now that relevant to that would be worth considering.
So I can expand a little bit on this rainfall question. I mean, there's a few things there. First of all, I've only got 16 years worth of data there. So I've kind of got 1 and a bit El Niños. I'd love it if I had 30, because that would then, 30 years of rainfall and fire data, because that would then allow me to show, you don't want to be extrapolating outside the bounds of your data. And so if you've got 3 El Niños, 3 extreme events there in your data, then you're pretty confident about what would happen as things start to maybe shift in a particular direction. And we are talking about cover shifting up and up and up. That's the whole question we're trying to get to here. What I've seen with the data that I've got on rainfall is that when you're having a big wet season, it often comes early, or it starts early. So instead of getting 0 millimeters of rain in September, you might get a whole bunch. And absolutely, it immediately causes the greenness to go up. Now, I tried controlling for it. I could control for that if I wanted, but then that adds a 5th variable, which reduces my degrees of freedom and makes the threshold for statistical significance harder. So instead, I just left it in, and you saw that big bump, which was 2010, okay? In fact, you can even see, I'll go back to right to the beginning. You can actually see it in this data, is that it looks like greenness precedes rain, which can't be right. But what's actually happening is that's the rainfall for that season. But some of that rainfall came early and bled into this earlier season here, okay? So a simple way to control for that is just add a variable that says how much did it rain in September, which is usually a fair indicator of an early and large wet season. So I did that, I put that in there, but of course it reduced the threshold of significance for all the coefficients, and I just was back where I started from. So yeah, that's how I address that.
Go to a meeting, so if it goes on long and I walk off, it's not because I'm bored. So you finished, your last slide was results, and I don't know how far through your candidature you are, but I was just looking for, like, you've given us a lot of detail about the methodology and then a summary, but how are you going to bring your story together? What's going to be your big picture message for your publication or for your thesis?
Well, yes, big picture message is that we've unpacked enough of the drivers of tree cover change to start to eliminate many of the different theories that have been tested and tried at various times in different places. Oh, that's a further answer to Steve's question, by the way. If I went back to any of these other study sites from other studies that use different methods or used a small area, I could actually do the same thing. I could put a polygon around their study site, run these variables, and then compare it to their findings and their conclusions. I could also take the flux tower data, for example, that's running along all the time, showing flows changing, and see if that related to my stocks. So yeah, I was going for a pretty simple conclusion, just add a little bit of knowledge, yeah, which is can we separate out these variables, and will that help us with a baseline and credit approach?
So that's pretty gutsy to write a thesis like that, because, you know, there's a microcosm of the energy and the reaction to, you know, what you're claiming versus what's gone before. So would it not be a good idea to maybe have a chapter where you do what you just said and gave, what do you call them, vignettes or examples, and then you could go and finish and say, this is where we've taken the theory for, or whatever you want to call it, forward? Because I reckon, yeah, it could be pretty controversial. Of my 30-something years here as a microbiologist, if I had a speck of the energy and anger and excitement around my work than is in the fireplace, I'd be very happy. And so that just gives you, you're in a very hot seat there.
Yeah, I'm actually doing a PhD in public policy. And this is just one little side work that I did to sort of help Andrew out because he's my co-supervisor and I'd like to help him out. My background is in politics and policy making and all the rest of it. So yeah, if you suddenly start giving out large quantities of additional credits to projects that are already running and that represent a significant proportion of the credits that are available on the market, that's going to have, I would say, pretty big market impact, right? All the full CAM model and everything else and all the momentum behind that is either got to relate to this or it's going to be in competition with it. It's a pretty big deal. So I'm like either the fossil fuel industry will be beating a path to my door for all these extra amazing credits that I've kind of just like discovered. Sorry if I'm being a bit, but in line of what you're saying, like that's one possible thing. The other thing is it just goes into a journal and sinks without a trace. I go bird watching or something. Thanks very much for coming.
So it's fundamentally about, if it's fundamentally about developing a methodology that's going to be approved for receiving carbon credits, then it's all about being able to demonstrate that greenness and changes in greenness has a very strong relationship to changes. And I guess that's where we're coming from, is that there's all sorts of issues there. And and one of the things that raises a bit of a red flag to me, other than these empirical things we're talking about, is that the year-to-year variation you're seeing at a site in greenness, and the fact that in many places the greenness in one year has barely any predictive power for the greenness in next year, is telling me something's wrong here, because biomass does not do that, at all. And so it'd be, well, what's happening? Why is this? And as some of the issues were raised, is that the reason for it, including you're getting some grasses coming in some years if you've got or whatever, and is it just the burning of the leaves? It's got anything, because even with that Walford project, can you put it back where you had, overall, it's up, but you see you've got between 2000 and, it's sort of, it's punctuated equilibrium almost, isn't it? And you sort of got a big jump and you think, well, how does that work? And then it drops down again. Well, see, that's not reflecting biomass. It's reflecting something. It's reflecting something else, and then it stops, and then big jump. You know what I mean? So this about greenness that is just not closely tied.
Look, there's noise in this data. Okay, I mean, this is this little point here is 3 months of Landsat slides. And then they don't take the average of them. They crunch them all together to find the sort of most representative example of it, right? And they have an error factor associated with these. So that's in there already. There's probably a pretty big error factor, I would say, with the rainfall, right? And the fire scars have their own errors and their own issues as well, right? So you've already got, no, not at all. So you're compounding the errors in your original data sources. If I get 25% R squared, that's actually pretty good, as long as the coefficients are strong and ecologically meaningful, because there's already a lot of noise in those input variables. Part two of this, okay? Andrew's given me thousands and thousands of measurements of individual trees in hundreds of plots stretching out over some, I don't know, going back 10, 15 years, okay? And what we're working on is trying to match those up to, again, observable top-down canopy. The beauty of that data set is you've got your little baby tree that's, every individual tree's got its own tag. So there's a tree that's there that wasn't there last time they sampled 3 years ago, or vice versa, it disappears after 3 years. Some smart person could get into all that floristics and all that, it's by species as well, get into all that changing vegetation dynamics. This is not a mountain ash forest. Doesn't just burn down and then shoot up again. Like, there's all sorts of things going on. But I've done some basic work just looking at this variable here against the measurements that were taken in various plots across various parts of the ecoregion. And it's good. It's good stuff. Probably needs some more statistical brain on it. Tell me if I'm seeing what I'm seeing. But yeah, no, it's not. That's right. If this shows greenness going up 1, 2, 3, does that mean that the biomass, the tree trunk did that and then shrunk again? Clearly not. No, it's got to be smoother than that, but we just want to know that it is going up over time, because what we've done here is we've created a baseline. That's the baseline. And from that, future developments will be measured so that we can strip out things like rainfall. Yeah, and look, fire may not actually change that much in future. You're going to get a fairly constant level of severe fire now, but are you going to see this go up after controlling for rainfall? The woodiness, I mean, obviously, as I said, there has to be some persistence in woody vegetation. It's not statistically possible for it to go from 0 cover to 100% cover. But it's like, can't find my keys. Well, go and look at the last place you saw them. All right. That's the statistical measure we're using here. In the absence of any other information, we'll just simply use the last known measure as our measure. So that's why that term has to be in there. I'd like to make it perform a little bit better if I could.
So, the greenness index, you said does it have to be over a 3-month period? Can you tailor that to rainfall?
No,
Could you?
Well, you can do it by rainfall. Thanks, mate. You can do it by month, but then you just have to de-seasonalise that again anyway. So we've got modus monthly.
Yes, I just wondered if you could tailor it to the rainfall in that month so that you're always getting the driest month as a way of reducing that variability in greenness.
Does it have to be month? Can it just be not driest?
Well, sometimes that would be September, sometimes that would be August, sometimes that would be October. And then when I add my preceding 12 months rainfall to that, do I use 12 months from that date, or do I always use the same?
Wet season, you would use the precipitation date end of July.
Yeah. Now, if I take a reading of greenness from different months to try and find the lowest one in each year, in each year, yeah. Look, as a follow-up, I'll send you a chart to show you what it actually looks like monthly, and then just taking the one, particularly for both rainfall and this, because it evens out over time is what I'd be saying about that. So it added a lot. I tested it. It just adds more work to the data set that I'm using, and then more adjustments to adjust for that adjustment, if you know what I mean.
Do you think this could be applied to other kind of other environmental services to prove that it's, increasing greenness? So that impact greenness, that potentially impact greenness, like feral animal management, compacting soils and affecting nutrient levels and things like that. And there was another one I thought of, but I can't think of now. And what about gamba? Does gamba increase fire severity and maybe impact, like would there be a correlation between lots of gamba and less greenness or something? Yeah.
I would think that for gamba there would be perhaps a signature. I mean, green's green, but its persistence or its amplitude, maybe it has a different amplitude of greenness to other grasses. Yeah. As I said, this is first year maths. Yeah, I imagine. But yep. Yeah, at the moment it's an exclusion. You have to excise your gamba, I think, at the moment in order to get credits, right? They don't give you credits for burning gamba because it just comes past. Yep.
Chemicals
yep.
or
Yep.
whatever way.
Yep.
So you can have a baseline where
Yep. Yep. So in relation to the first part of your question, though, yes, I also waded into the controversy, what's now been a controversy about the destocking pasture lands in Western New South Wales. And, now Andrew McIntosh hit the roof, right, and said that it's not real. A year earlier, I was already looking at that using the exact same model. The difference is there's hardly any fire. So it's just what's vegetation cover doing? What did rainfall do? And we just control for, but there I'm using 30 years of data. So I'm controlling for 3 El Nino cycles. And then, yes, we all assume, perhaps it's not right, but we all assume that on a certain day they destocked it. And then what's happened since then. So it's the same time series intervention analysis. It's less complicated if you don't have to deal with severe and frequent fire, right? Try and do it in a mountain ash forest. I don't quite know what sort of result you would get, but that's down the line.
Just thinking about your paper, if the idea is to look at woody thickening, because at the beginning that was kind of your message, perhaps you could just filter out all these sites. Did you say you have about 90 sites? 96 sites, yeah. So would you be able to say how many of these actually have a long-term trend of increasing greenness?
Yes.
Yeah.
25 of them do.
Okay, 25 only.
Just using that simple linear
Yeah, right.
measurement, right? So it's not everywhere. But what I haven't done is sort of segment the projects according to how often are they burning? Well, we know how often severe fires going down, how many credits they were issued.
Perhaps look at these 25 and see your coefficients just for these 25.
Yes. Yep, I'll absolutely do that. Kirsten, can you? Yep. Just do the same thing, but I need to segment them. I need to segment them into active and inactive projects, and maybe into those that showed a trend and those that didn't. There's some bush heritage projects that aren't generating any credits that are registered. I'm pretty sure they are doing new burning, but they're not getting any credits. But are they having any impact on my variable? I don't know. The other source of noise in this, by the way, is the vegetation itself. I mean, if you've got monsoon forest in the middle of that, then that's going to, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. If you've got monsoon forest in there, that'll behave differently. Obviously, if you've got wetlands, well, there's no woody cover there, but they'll burn at a certain amount of time. So, you know, there's a bunch of sources of noise in there. Considering that, I'm actually pretty happy. I thought there'd be some point where I just went, nah, this was a dead end. But so far we're moving forward. Okay, well, I guess that's it.